I think Micah deserves a round of applause, so I believe we can just close the service in prayer. But that was a very clear, commendable description, Micah. There was Micah, the historian, the theologian, the Bible scholar, all rolled into one. And I propose that we invite Micah to preach next Sunday. Good work, Micah. Thank you very much. But on a serious note, I believe that these folk who attended the conference or the talk were greatly blessed. Now, we continue with our series on lesser known or hidden heroes of the New Testament church. And last Sunday, actually, Micah referred to that. He talked about Simon Peter, and we looked at Cornelius. You remember we looked at Acts chapter 10 and how Peter was prepared and Cornelius was prepared. And we talked about the fact that Cornelius required less preparation. Because in Acts chapter 10, verse 1 and 2, we see that he was in sync with God, he was giving, he was praying, and he was ready for a deeper experience with God. While Peter was also ready, we saw last Sunday that Peter required more preparation because Peter resisted, Peter was struggling. And we talked about that, and we said that Cornelius was this one individual whom God used to break barriers in the New Testament church. Because up until that time, most of the believers or who were part of the New Testament church were from a Jewish background. And now God was breaking that barrier, and he was using Cornelius to prepare Peter to break that barrier. Now, tucked away in that story, even though Randolph read 16 verses, tucked away in that whole episode, we see another person by the name of Simon. And he was Simon the tanner. And his profession is very interesting because these days you get into your leather production, your leather handbags and your leather jackets and all of that. But we also know that it all begins in a tannery house or a place where skins and hides are tanned. But before we do that, I do want to tell you a story. I was waiting for Micah to come back. He's just making his grand reappearance. But this story is of a young fellow who was new in his church, and he was on the ushering team. He was not on the tech team, he was not on the worship team, but he joined the ushers, the ushering team or the team of ushers. And so for the first time, he was assigned to the door. This is a new church, he's new, and people are coming in, and suddenly he notices a lady more on the advanced side of life, more on the elderly side of life, and she walks in slowly, and he reaches out to her, he greets her, welcomes her, and says, "May I find you a seat?" She says, "Yes, please." And he finds her a seat at the back of the church, more like where the Sandons and Esther are seated. Nothing personal on that, but that's kind of where he found them, the seat. And the lady says, "No, I like to go up front. I sit up front." And this new usher, this young man, he bent down, he whispered to the lady, and he said, "If I were you, I would sit to the back." And the lady asked, "And why is that, young man?" She said, "Because the pastor's sermons are long, it's boring, it's complicated. You want to sit at the back, and then anytime you want to leave, you can do so." And the lady was annoyed. Her countenance was visibly different, and she was annoyed, and she asked the young man, "Do you know who I am?" And the young man said, "No, ma'am, I don't know who you are." And he said, "I am the pastor's mother." And then the young usher realized he had got himself into a mess. So he quickly asked a question, "Ma'am, do you know who I am?" And the lady said, "No, I don't know who you are." And he said, "Thank the Lord for that. You don't know who I am." And he disappeared into the crowd. Now, that story reminds us of an individual, this young usher, who did not want to be known because he had made a mess of things. He just disappeared into the crowd. And we have people like that in this day and age, and we've met people like that who do not want to be known, who want to remain anonymous because they've made a mess of things. We also know of individuals who do want to be known for all the good work that they are doing. They want to talk about it, they want to be in the limelight, and they want to make sure that everybody knows that they have done some good work. You also have people who do a lot of good work, but are quite happy to remain in the background. People who do a lot of good work for the kingdom of God, people who engage in service, people who reach out to help other people, but they wish to remain in the background. They want to remain as hidden heroes. And that really is what our series is all about. And if you want some affirmation and encouragement, you might say that this series is actually a tribute to all of you at Fairview Church of God, because you are fine people who've done so much, who continue to do so much for God's kingdom, but you do not want to be recognized. In fact, I know some of you say, Pastor Ben, we are doing this for God, but we don't want anything mentioned, nothing talked about. So as we journey through this series, I want for you to know this is a tribute to each one of you for all that you do for the extension of God's kingdom. And may God bless you. May God expand the borders of your service so that you can continue to help more and more people in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So, as I said, we are looking at the life of Simon the tanner. And it is very interesting that the Apostle Peter stays with Simon the tanner. Now, in the Bible, there are many professions. You will find fishermen, you will find carpenters, you will find doctors like Luke, as Micah mentioned. You will find different individuals, different professions. But there are some professions which are frowned upon. You know, like tax collectors. You talked about the sycamore tree, Micah. Tax collector, Zacchaeus, that profession was frowned upon. And you have other professions that people frowned upon, and they do not think much of these professions. Now, tanning, or Simon the tanner, and his profession where he dealt with hides and animal skin and all of that, was frowned upon as well. Now, in the Old Testament, you recognize that there were tents that the people of Israel lived in. There were bells, there were water bags or water pouches, as we call them. These were all made with leather. And they came from hides, they came from skins, and these were used and appreciated. But the process from where you got your leather, starting off from raw hides, and all the processes and the practices and the procedures that they were subject to were not very pleasant. In fact, even in this day and age, if you Google about tanning and how leather is produced, you will see the process, even in this modern age with technology, is not a very pleasant one. They use all kinds of techniques. In fact, there is one that I read about. It's called fleshing and salting. And it means that the process of removing the flesh from the skin and subjecting that to salt treatment, it's a long, complicated, and not a very pleasant one. And I want you to go back to the time when Acts chapter 9 was written and get a glimpse as to what it may have been like to be a tanner during those times. And so scholars tell us that a typical tanner's operation during these times would have been a 2-room operation, where in one room the tanner probably lived, and another room where he stored the finished products, the hides, and there was an open balcony or a rooftop where the processing was done and things were left to dry and things were left there for the process to be completed. And why was Simon the tanner's house close to the sea? If you listen to the reading that Randolph brought to us today, you will recognize it says that his house was by the sea. Very likely because he received the pelts from the ships that came into Joppa. and he needed the salt and the seawater for the process of preparing, of transforming the hides into the final finished products. All this to say that this is where his house was. And Peter is sent to Simon the tanner's house. Now, I want to say that if you have a choice to make in terms of where you stay, a tanner's house is not the greatest place to stay. And I'm sure at some point in our lives, people have asked this question, could you not find a better blank? I'm sure when you went out to eat and you found a place to eat and the food came along, somebody in the group has said at some point, could you not find a better place to eat? I'm sure when you dressed up for an event, people close to you may have asked at some point, could you not find a better attire to fit into? Or if you went out to stay at a place after all the booking was done, somebody asks, could you not find a better place for us to stay for the holidays? We get asked that question, if not once, maybe a few times. And as you read of this encounter, this narrative, you ask the question, could God have not found a better place for Simon Peter to prepare himself for this new and significant encounter? If you remember our reflection from last Sunday, God used Cornelius. Peter visited Cornelius' house. You remember our reflection not last Sunday, but 2 Sundays ago. Last Sunday we had Gary Stagg. That's why it sounds like it was a long time ago before we got into this message. But when Peter gets over to Cornelius' house, we will see that he had to struggle with going over. Great breakthrough in the life of the New Testament church. But where does Peter see the vision? Where does Peter see the trance? Where does he receive this deep revelation from God? It was at the house of Simon the tanner. And I'd like to say this was not the grandest of place to be receiving God's revelation. It was, shall we say, a messy place. He was on the rooftop. That's what the Bible, the Word of God tells us, that he was on the rooftop. And he stayed there with Simon the tanner for a few days. How he survived the few days in that very unpleasant and smelly environment is anybody's guess. But it is here that God's revelation came to him. It is here that he received a deeper message from God and that vision to break that barrier. And I want to submit to all of us today that sometimes even in our lives, we find ourselves in a mess. By a mess, I'm not referring to the bad odors and the unpleasant situations that we are living in the physical realm, but a mess might mean something where you cannot move. You are stuck on all sides, and nothing seems to be moving. There doesn't seem to be any traction. In fact, the more you pray, the situation that you're in seems to be getting worse. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. It seems to be one long, dark tunnel with no light at all. And you're praying and you're waiting and nothing seems to move. And you're pressed from all sides. It might be a mess with regards to a family situation, or it might be regards to health. It might be with regards to something at work. It seems that nothing is moving. Everything is so unpleasant. And you come to that point where you're saying, God, I can't take this anymore. You've got to bring about a breakthrough. But I want to submit to you today that God has very interesting ways in working in and through our messes. You remember another messy environment that took place or that happened at Bethlehem, which we will celebrate not very long from now at the end of this year. We, I'm sure, have gone to Christmas narratives, narrations, depictions of Christmas. I'm sure you had some here as well. You had the manger, you had the angels, you had all the wise men and shepherds coming in, and they reenact the first Christmas. But there's one thing that you don't get with all these reenactments and these depictions. You don't get the smells from the manger. Maybe you should try that sometimes for a depiction. But it is not very nice. But that is where God chose to reveal himself to mankind. With all the smells, with all the mess, with all the cattle and the animals doing what they do well in situations like that. I take you to another story in the Old Testament. You remember Job. And Job was in a mess. Everything that was his was taken away, and he was languishing. He had covered himself with ash, and he had covered himself with ash and sackcloth, and he was languishing in mourning. And it was in this mess that God revealed himself in a deeper way. Now, before, Job knew God. Job had a wonderful relationship with God. But as a result of this mess that he was in, you see in Job chapter 42 verses 1 to 6, Job says, I thought I knew you, but now I understand you in a deep way. I submit to you, I share with you another story from the Old Testament. You remember Joseph. Joseph, when he was a younger fellow and a younger man, he knew that God's hand was upon him. But then he was thrown into prison. And that was a real mess in a physical sense, because prisons in those days were not very clean, not very pleasant places. Further, Joseph was in a mess because he was accused unfairly. He was accused for something, he was accused of something he never did. But it was in those messy days and messy moments that I believe that he received a deeper revelation from God about maturing, because when he comes out, he is a different individual. I also share with you the life of Daniel in the Old Testament. Now, Daniel, we read very quickly, was sent into exile. And exile for us is a nice 5-letter word. But for those like Daniel, when they went into exile, it was a mess. And I'll tell you why it was a mess. They were plucked away from everything that was known as familiar, as lovely, everything that was their home. They were plucked away from their family, from their friends, and they were transported to a new country, a new culture, and strange ways of living. So that was his mess, and the mess of all his colleagues. But in that mess is where God started to use Daniel and his friends as instruments of his power. And so even as we might be going through what I call a quote-unquote mess, where things might not be going the way we desired, where things might have slowed down and you might find that everything is so unpleasant and it is getting even more intense, I invite you to pray a little differently. Our usual prayers are, God, remove this mess. Remove the people who are causing the mess. Remove everything that's the root cause of this mess. But I invite you to pray a little differently, where you would say, God, reveal more of yourself to me in this situation. And that's exactly what happened to Peter. And God used Simon the tanner's place, a very unpleasant situation, to reveal something of profound importance to Peter, where he was saying, you are being prepared for the next stage. You know about the vision. I won't go into it because we've talked about it 2 Sundays ago. But the simple thought that I want to leave for us is, when you are in the mess, try praying a little differently, where we say, God, I'm in this. I don't understand why. I don't understand for how long, but take me deeper and reveal more of yourself in this situation. And you might ask, what's the reward of being in this situation? The reward is God himself. We remember Genesis 15. I've shared this verse some months ago, where God tells Abraham, Abraham, I am your shield, and I am your righteous, your great and exceedingly righteous reward. God is saying, I am your reward. We don't seek another reward for following God. because God is our reward. And so I pray, I hope that as you go through this, perhaps an unpleasant situation that you might be facing, that you would pray and we would all pray and say, God, reveal more of yourself to me so that I might have a clear and a deeper understanding of who you are. May God bless the reflection of his word.